Now that the breakdown department's PCR is complete, we can make the product cost report for the second phase of production, which is the molding department. So flipping over to the molding department, we've got pretty much the same information going on over here, but our data table at the top does have a couple of question marks that we should fill in first. And they are how many units that we started molding into bins during December and what amount of transferred in costs were added to this department during December. Well, this is the second phase of production, which means that the amount of units that we start molding, it has to be equal to the amount of units that were broken down and transferred to us from the breakdown department. And the amount of costs added that were transferred into us from previous phases of production has to be equal to the costs that were transferred out by the previous department. So in this instance over here, what we're going to have for our number of units started in December is going to be equal to the number of units that were transferred out of the previous department. Going back to the breakdown PCR, how many physical units were transferred out from the breakdown department? That is 45,000. And then in terms of the costs that got added during the period, what amount of transferred in costs are new for the molding department during December? Well, the costs that were transferred out during December from the previous phase of production, the breakdown department. And going over here to the breakdown department, the amount of costs that were added by the molding department has to be equal to the 270,000 that was transferred in from the previous phase of production. So now we've got all of the numbers that we need to work with. And it's the same process that we just did for the breakdown department. We just have an extra column now. Since this is not the first phase of production, we're going to have a separate column on our production cost report that keeps track of all of the costs that were transferred in from the previous phase of production. But the process is still going to be exactly the same. Let's first make sure we know what our units are at. So for physical units that were in beginning WIP, our information tells us that the molding department had 6,000 bins that they were working on when the period started. And then during the period, the breakdown department sent another 45,000 bins to the molding department to be molded into finished bins. So all in all, between what was here and what was transferred to us during December, we've got 51,000 bins that we need to account for. Let's account for them. How many units did molding transfer out? Since the last phase of production, they're transferring to finished goods. We could say how many finished bins were transferred off to be sold into our finished goods inventory. Well, our information on the top tells us that there was 48,000 units that got completed during December and moved to finished goods inventory. And at the end of December, the molding department is still working on 3,000 bins worth of plastic, finishing molding them up into finished bins that we can sell. But if we add those two numbers together, we've got 51,000 units that we have accounted for. Zoom in one more time for you. There we go. Now we just need our equivalency so we can do our math later. Well, for transferred in, it's how complete these units, whether they're the transferred out ones or the ones in ending WIP, are done for the costs of the previous departments in our production process. We're the last phase right now in molding. These units that are in molding, even the ones in ending WIP, they would not be here in the second phase of production were they not done for all of the costs of the previous phases of production before them. So for your entire transferred in column, your equivalent units is going to be just equal to your physical units, always going to be the same. As per your materials and your conversion costs over here, those units that were transferred out to be sold have to be completely done, which means they're done for all of the necessary material costs that would be added by the molding department. So that's going to be the same as our physical units for direct materials. They also have to be done for all the conversion costs that were required by the molding department. So your completed and transferred outline is just the same all the way across. All of those 48,000 units that were transferred off to be sold are done for all of the breakdown costs necessary to break down the old plastic into new plastic that can be made into bins. And then all of the material costs and conversion costs that are required to take that reformed plastic and turn it into a finished sellable bin. The only difference we're going to have here is these 3,000 units in ending WIP because they're not done for materials and they're not done for conversion costs. As we see up on top on our information, they're only 40% done for materials and 70% done for conversion costs. So let's go through and convert that. How many units could we have made in the entirety for the same amount of material cost that we paid to make these last 3,000 units 40% done? Take your physical units and ending WIP and multiply them by the percentage of completion for that component. Those 3,000 units in ending WIP are only 40% done for materials. Well, we could have made 1,200 bins in total for that same amount of cost that it took us to make 3,000 less than half the way. Do the same thing over here for your conversion costs. Take the 3,000 units in ending WIP, multiply it by the 70% they are complete for conversion costs, and you come up with 2,100, which means we could have made 2,100 bins for the same amount of conversion costs that we paid to make these 3,000 units 70% complete. And then for your total units accounted for your total equivalent units of production, just add together your completed and transferred out and your ending WIP for both of these. And we determine in this case that for the amount of cost that we paid to fully finish 48,000 bins and partially complete these 3,000 bins, we could have made 49,200 bins in total for the amount of material costs that we paid and 50,100 bins in total for the amount of conversion costs that we paid. And now let's assign out some costs. Same process that we had before. For our beginning WIP, there was costs already committed to it. Our information on the top tells us that this WIP had $30,900 of transferred in costs already contained in it when December started. We had already been working on molding this plastic into bins, and that batch that was in our beginning WIP had already had $1,400 in material costs added to it, and it also had already had $18,720 of conversion costs added to it. So if you go through and add all of them together, you get $51,020. There's $51,020 worth of costs already committed to beginning WIP. And then what got added during the period for transferred in, it's that $270,000 worth of cost that the breakdown department transferred to the molding department when they transferred plastic that was ready to be made in bins. For materials, the molding department added $8,440 of material costs that's unique to this department to 2 units during the period. And they also added, according to our information, $176,670 of conversion costs. So if I go through and I add all of these together, I come up with $455,110 worth of costs that were added by the molding department, either by themselves for the stuff that they do for materials and conversion costs, or to the units that they're molding that were transferred in from the previous phase of production. But add what was in beginning WIP to what was added during the period, and you get the total amount of costs you have to account for. We've got to account for $300,900 of transferred in costs. We're going to need to account for a total of $9,840 in material costs. We're going to need to account for a total of $195,390 of conversion costs and add those three numbers together, the transferred in costs, the material costs, and the conversion costs, and you get $506,130. That is the total amount of cost that we've got to figure out how we're going to split it up between the units that we transfer out to finished goods and the units, the 3,000 here, that are still hanging out in our ending WIP in the molding department. So let's break it down to a per unit basis by dividing those costs to account for by our total equivalent units of production. And up here, we've decided that our total units to account for equivalent units of production for transfer in was 51,000. For direct materials, it was 49,200. And for conversion costs, it was 50,100. And if I go through and say that $300,900 worth of transferred in costs was enough to make 51,000 bins, well, then each bin cost us $5.90 in cost. Not that was added by the molding department, but that was added by the departments before them in the production process. Same thing for materials. We spent $9,840 worth of materials costs that are unique to the molding department during the period. That's enough to make 49,200 bins. Therefore, each bin costs us 20 cents in materials to mold from recycled plastic into a finished bin. And for conversion costs at $195,390 divided by the 50,100 total equivalent units of production for conversion costs means that each bin that we convert from a pile of recycled plastic into a finished sellable bin costs us $3.90 in conversion cost to mold. Now that we've got a rate basis, we can just assign it out. For completed and transferred out, we transferred out 48,000 bins. Each bin costs us $5.90 in transferred in costs, in breakdown costs, if you will. So that means that those 48,000 units that were transferred out, we're going to assume cost us $283,200. We transferred out 48,000 units here. Each one of those costs us 20 cents in material cost, unique to the molding department to mold them into a finished sellable bin. So at 20 cents a piece, those 48,000 units cost us $9,600. And for our conversion cost, those 48,000 units that we transferred out, each one of those costs us $3.90 in conversion cost to convert from a pile of plastic to a finished bin. That's a total of 187,200. Add those three numbers together, and we are saying that all in all, not just between the molding department, but between all phases of production, those units that we transferred out to finished goods, those 48,000 units, cost us a total of $480,000 to produce. What about ending WIP? Well, our equivalent units of production for ending work in process is 3,000 for transferred in. Multiply that by the 590 cost per equivalent unit for transferred in, and you get 17,700. So those 3,000 units that we have in ending WIP for the molding department, we're going to assume have already had $17,700 of breakdown costs committed to them that were transferred into the molding department. The equivalent units of production for ending WIP in terms of materials was 1,200. The amount of cost we committed should have been enough to make 1,200 units from start to finish. And each unit completely created and molded into a bin over here costs us 20 cents in material costs that are unique to the molding department. So we're going to assume there's $240 worth of costs committed for materials to those units in ending WIP. And then from the same process for conversion cost, take your 2,100 equivalent units that are in your ending WIP for conversion cost, multiply it by the 390 per equivalent unit, and we're going to assume those units in ending WIP have already had $8,190 spent on them for conversion costs to complete them the part of the way that they were done when December ended. And I add those three numbers together, 17,700 plus 240 plus 8,190, make up with 26,130. We're going to say that is the value of our ending WIP within the molding department at the end of the period. And now just add together the amount of transferred in costs that we are transferring out to finished goods and the amount that we're containing in our ending WIP. And we've accounted for $300,900 worth of transferred in costs. Do the same thing for materials and do the same thing for conversion costs, labor and overhead combined. And we've accounted for a total, add these three numbers together on the bottom, of $506,130 worth of production costs. Out of that 506,130, 480,000 is going to be assumed to be in units that were transferred off to finished goods to be sold, hopefully, while the other 26,130 is tied up in those bins that we were still working on when December ended. But our cost to account for line and our cost accounted for line is a direct mirror of one another, so we know we're good to go here as well. So we've got the flow of inventory costs going through our production process, starting from scratch at the beginning of the breakdown. All the plastic gets broken down. When the plastic's finished being broken down and is in a suitable condition to be molded into bins, it's transferred to the molding department and costs are transferred with it. Molding department adds costs. When they finish molding stuff, they transfer it off to finished goods, except for the portion that's tied up in units that they're still working on at the end of the period. But between these two PCRs, we have the flow of our inventory costs as they made their way through our company's production process. Sorry about that, but through Rewind Recycling's production process during the period. And the PCRs are fine, but they're just references for the numbers. We know where we can find all these numbers that we needed to put them on our books, but this alone is not going to put them on our books. So that's what we're going to do in the next step in the next video when we record our journals.